During these very difficult times that we have experienced as individuals and as a country, Sandy Spring Museum too has experienced challenges grappling with the role we play in a system that benefits some at the expense of others. Sandy Spring Museum stands firmly with those fighting against the racism, structural disadvantages, and systematic injustice that have oppressed Black people in the United States for hundreds of years. The United States was built on discriminatory practices that were codified in our legal system, beginning with the dehumanization of Native people, followed by enslaving Black people in bondage as property for the financial benefit of those of white European ancestry. Sandy Spring Museum stands on land that was once a plantation where Black people were enslaved. We recognize that the museum is the beneficiary of a historically unjust system. We are committed to working towards dismantling systems that perpetuate racism and discrimination in order to build a just, equal society. Tonight's program is one of many programs that we host that challenges the dominant narrative. I'm introducing Allison Weiss, Director of the Sandy Spring Museum.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. As Michael said, my name is Allison Weiss. I'm the Director of the museum, and I want to welcome you for coming to this evening's program. I know we have a lot of new people in the audience tonight, so I just wanted to very briefly welcome you in particular and tell you about the mission of the museum, which is to support community-driven cultural arts and educational programs in order to build community. I also wanted to thank Ellen Ross, who is the Howard M. and Charles F. Jenkins Professor of Quakerism and Peace Studies at Swarthmore College, for introducing me to tonight's guest speaker. So thank you, Ellen. I believe she's in the audience tonight. And it is my pleasure to introduce our guest moderator, who is Joy Turner. Joy is a native of Sandy Spring and a descendant of the Howard Holland family, one of the notable African-American founding families in the community. She's a historic consultant and educator who holds degrees from the University of Central Oklahoma and Butler University. Joy's worked with numerous community organizations, developing and executing historic projects and programming, including the Sandy Spring Slave Museum, Sandy Spring Museum, the Menard Foundation, and Woodlawn Manor Cultural Park. Her current research project is a study of the interpersonal relationships and collaborative efforts between the Black and white Sandy Spring communities after the completion of school integration in 1961. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Joy.
Thank you very much, Allison. It is my pleasure to be here tonight, and it is my honor to moderate and to introduce Ms. Betsy Cazden. Ms. Cazden is an active Quaker and a former lawyer. She is an independent historian based in Providence, Rhode Island. She holds degrees from Oberlin College, Harvard Law School, and Andover Newton Theological School, and has written several scholarly journals in the Cobblestone, Harvard Magazine, and Rhode Island Roots. Her current research project is on Quakers and slavery in Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts from 1660 to 1785. At least one slave-holding ancestor is in her family, Richard Borden, and it is a part of her work. Before we begin with Ms. Cazden, I would like to ask you all to please put your questions in the chat box. Ms. Cazden has broken this presentation into 3 sections. After each section, we will read some of the questions and she will give her answers as we move through. And then we will answer more questions at the end of the presentation. Again, it is our pleasure to welcome Ms. Elizabeth Cazden.
Thank you, Joy, and thanks to Allison and also to Michael. We could not do these programs without a tech person and to tell us all when we're not unmuted. It's also really heartening to see what this museum is doing. It's happening at sites all over the country that changes and expands the narrative of how we think about the past to include all the voices, all of the stories of all of the people who lived in these places. And I've just come to appreciate what local museums and historical societies are doing that really fills out the record. in order to dismantle systems of racism and inequality, you first have to understand them and describe them. So I see my work as teasing out one small piece of that. I'm going to go ahead, assuming this works, and share my screen so you're not looking at me all night. Okay, there we are. So I know there are some of my Quaker friends in the audience. I recognize some names and faces, but some of the rest of you may not be. How many of you, when you think of Quakers, you're thinking about your grade school stories about William Penn, or you're thinking of this guy? Yeah. Who was invented by the Quaker Oats Company. Often when people think about Quakers and slavery, they're thinking about the Underground Railroad. This picture probably portrays Levi and Catherine Coffin, active in the Underground Railroad in Ohio and Indiana, and the model for the Quaker couple in Uncle Tom's Cabin. As many of you probably know, by around 1830, many, although not all Quakers, were active abolitionists. They led anti-slavery societies, they lobbied, and a lot of them helped formerly enslaved people to establish new lives. Quakers have been eager to portray themselves as way ahead of the curve, and many others have written about us that way as well. Even scholars, until recently, often wrote as if Quakers always had a firm policy against slavery. But that wasn't true before about 1770, and it wasn't easy getting there. So that's what I want to trace this evening. As Joy said, this is kind of a personal saga for me as well, because my mother's ancestors, the ones who came from England in 1634 to Boston and then almost immediately to Rhode Island, and were early converts to Quakerism. When he died, he left 5 enslaved Negroes, as it says, and that was in 1671. So when I saw that in one of those old 19th century genealogy books, I was curious to know how common that was for Quakers of that time and place. The short answer is it was pretty common, probably as common for Quakers as for non-Quakers. So if you're one of those people who knows that your colonial ancestors also claimed ownership in African slaves, and you're not quite sure what to do with that information, you're part of actually a very large conversation, and it's good that we talk about it. I'm also interested in this project and generally in how people link what they say and believe and how they actually live and how those things change over time. So how many people right now are deeply concerned about the climate crisis and fossil fuels, but we're still driving cars? And a lot of us can't figure out how to not do that, how to heat our homes that isn't oil if you're in the Northeast. So my research looks both at what Quakers said about slavery and also what they did and how that changed very broadly from it's okay as long as you treat them well to you can't do that here. So as Joy said, I've got 3 sections. First, I'm going to give some background on how Quakers got started, basic Quaker beliefs and practices. Second, Quaker involvement in the system of enslavement. And third, how that changed and how they became anti-slavery. I will pause after each section, so go ahead and type questions into the chat, and then Joy will pull them when we get there. All right, first, background on Quakerism. Quakers started in England around 1650 during the English Civil War. The label Quaker was actually thrown at them by a judge who was mocking them because they said they trembled before God. They mostly called themselves publishers of truth or just the people of God. By 1700, the Quaker movement had gotten more institutionalized with record keeping and formal structure, and used the name the Religious Society of Friends. So Quakers, and as we say, capital F Friends, mean the same thing, and I'll use both terms. Quakers' fundamental belief was that any person could directly experience God's grace and guidance. You didn't need an intermediary. Our founder, George Fox, put it in his journal that he was a distressed young man who was dissatisfied and kind of discouraged by both Anglican priests and the dissenting preachers. Then he says he heard a voice which said, "There is one, even Christ Jesus, that can speak to thy condition. And when I heard it, my heart did leap for joy." And he went around preaching and built up a following and so on. Unlike most other Christian bodies, we don't believe that you need the outward sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist to get to that inward communion with the divine. Quakers do, or at least did do in some places, rely heavily on the Bible, although with some unique interpretations. They refuse to swear oaths because Jesus said not to, or to pay tithes or taxes to support an established church or a paid clergy. The worship isn't a set liturgy. Quakers gathered, many of us still, gather in expectant waiting for whatever message God puts in someone's heart to deliver. And they affirmed that God can call anybody to be that minister without formal training, even servants and even women. They also very early on adopted a testimony against war, refusing to serve in militias or in armed slave patrols. In 1656-57, around in there, Quaker Publishers of Truth left England and went out throughout the British Atlantic. Crucially, and they landed in places already settled by English men and women. Crucially, those settlers had had a generation already of living in the colonies, with well-established patterns of land ownership, crops, and commerce. So sugar plantations in the Caribbean and tobacco in the Chesapeake were already the dominant economic base, and labor patterns were already shifting away from European indentured servants to enslaved Africans. The Quaker evangelists appealed to seekers among these English settlers who were already dissatisfied with the established church, whether that church in that area was Puritan, Anglican, Catholic, or whatever. Within a couple of years, there are identified Quaker enclaves in the West Indies, Chesapeake Bay, Long Island, and New England. Philadelphia comes much, 30 years later. We like to tell them that, remind them of that. The first Quaker minister to Maryland, I discovered, was Elizabeth Harris in 1656. Josiah Cole and Thomas Thurston followed the next year and were promptly imprisoned for refusing to take an oath, as the Maryland government expressed alarm over, quote unquote, the increase of the Quakers. In these early years, the governing authorities often viewed Quakers as somewhere between meddlesome nuisances and a serious threat to public order, bordering on blasphemy, witchcraft, anarchy, or treason. Numerous friends were cart-whipped, fined, or jailed for holding unauthorized house worship instead of attending the official church, failing to pay tithes, or failing to have children baptized. 4 Quakers who persisted in preaching in Boston after being banished were actually hanged. Mary Dyer is the most famous, and I'm descended from her too. Quakers found relatively safe haven in Rhode Island and to some extent in Maryland. And over time, the government changed and friends changed, becoming more respectable, somewhat less radical, and less persecuted. In 1672, George Fox made a visit to all the Quaker settlements in the British colonies, from Barbados to Maine, including West River and the Eastern Shore, where there were already meetings. His goal was to create a structure to unify the dispersed movement. And he set up a system similar to Presbyterians, as I understand it, with local meetings for business and discipline accountable to larger quarterly meetings, which met quarterly, and then to yearly meetings. Maryland actually had a half-yearly meeting, which met alternately on both sides of the bay, at West River and at Third Haven. This is Third Haven today. It's said to be the oldest surviving meeting house in the North American colonies, built originally in 1684, although it's obviously had substantial remodeling since. Unlike other denominations, Fox also at the same time set up women's business meetings at all levels. Some matters were decided jointly and others only by the men or only by the women, and that varies from place to place. Each yearly meeting is fairly autonomous, but in the 1700s, they were all accountable to the yearly meeting in London, which issued regular epistles of advice, they were called advice, and direction, and also sent out ministers on extended pastoral visits to the colonies. All right, that's a bit of background. Joy, do we have any questions yet? You're muted.
At this time, we don't have any questions from the audience, but I would like to ask you in terms of Maryland, the Quakers were persecuted here as they came into Maryland, I believe you mentioned. Was that persecution similar to what you described in Rhode Island?
I'm not as familiar with Maryland as I am with Rhode Island because it's just not what I've, I haven't read all the minutes, and there are other people in the audience who may have more information specifically about Maryland. I don't know of any place where there wasn't at least some tension. Rhode Island was easier because the things specific about worship were not an issue. You did not have to pay to support the town minister as you did in Massachusetts.
One more question we have from Charlotte Ellis. She wants to know more about the Quakers in Pennsylvania. Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, so the Quakers in Pennsylvania, it's sort of a different wave of migration. Pennsylvania was largely, not entirely, but largely settled by people. First of all, it settled much later than this. Philadelphia was settled starting in the late 1670s into the early 80s. And groups of people who were already Quaker in England and Wales moved, in some cases, a couple of the Welsh meetings basically emptied out and migrated as a group to Pennsylvania. So they're coming to the colonies at a very different time. The people that I'm working with in New England and also in Maryland around the Chesapeake were colonists first, and then 20 years later become Quakers. And I think that's significant because their patterns of thinking about their relationship with indigenous people and with slavery are kind of set before they become Quakers. And also they were not in England through the period of the ferment of the Civil War. People who came to Pennsylvania had lived through the Civil War. So it's kind of a different thing. But Pennsylvania also was a society with slavery. William Penn owned slaves. A lot of Philadelphia Quakers owned slaves. And you'll see later on in the talk, they too had a difficult time making the transition.
Thank you. And we've got one more question before we move on from Deborah Boggs. And she would like to know, where is the meeting that is pictured here?
This is Third Haven on the eastern shore of Maryland. I can't describe it more than that without a map, and I didn't put a map in my slides.
Thank you very much. And one more before we go. Did Quakers from Barbara Platt and John Butler, did Quakers own or manage sugar plantations? What would be the largest number of enslaved people owned or rented by Quakers?
Yeah, I don't know the largest number. I know that Abraham Redwood, who's a prominent Rhode Island friend, the Redwood Library in Newport is named for him because he started it. Their family came from Antigua to Rhode Island, and they kept the Antigua plantation, and I want to say he had 325 on the Antigua plantation. They were large landowners. I'll talk more about that in the next section. So I think we'll move on.
Yes, thank you very much.
All right, so that's a good segue into what about slavery? Before 1770, 1780, Quakers, like their Anglican Congregational Baptist neighbors, significantly tolerated and adapted to slavery and the slave trade. My Rhode Island people were shopkeepers, merchants, sea captains, and had a robust trade selling onions, sheep, horses, and some other foodstuffs to West Indies sugar planters. And this is one of those New Deal era post office murals that the government commissioned. And this was in Wakefield in southern Rhode Island, what we call South County, showing livestock and barrels of things being loaded onto a ship by enslaved labor heading for the West Indies. At least a few were, I didn't want that one. At least a few Quakers were directly engaged in voyages to the African coast. And I can name some names in Rhode Island. but there were others from other parts of the country. In Maryland, they were tobacco planters like their neighbors. Again, they were tobacco planters first, and then they became Quakers, and they didn't give up the tobacco. One source says that as a regular thing, after the half-yearly meeting at West River, Quaker planters would, before they went home, they would board the slave ships to buy a fresh supply of workers for their plantation. It's difficult to get firm data, but it's pretty clear that it's a large number of Quakers in all parts of the American colonies. Occasionally you see indigenous slaves. More often the indigenous people are indentured for a period of time and sometimes for life. And then you see Africans. This lovely painting is from the Newport Historical Society, the John Potter family with their Negro boy serving tea, oh so politely. So the Quaker patterns look to me pretty much like the overall pattern, with more enslaved workers in port cities like Newport, New York, Philadelphia, and on large commercial farms, but many households and workshops with one or two, maybe three. A man to help with the farm work and a woman to help in the kitchen, and maybe a little boy that you're raising up, and in the meantime, he's serving the tea. In these early years, very few Quakers seem to have seen anything wrong with slavery as such. They generally accepted what it says in the Bible, that all humans are created of one blood. In other words, we're one species, and that we should love our neighbor. Nowadays, you hear Quakers talk about a testimony of equality, treating people the same regardless of race, gender. Sometimes you add sexual orientation, immigration status, et cetera, et cetera. But before 1800, that's certainly not what I see. There is spiritual equality, that the experience of grace and a potential call to ministry were available to everybody, sometimes called universalism. That's different from Puritans and Baptists, who in a somewhat different way thought that some people could be saved and some people couldn't. It's the old, there are two kinds of people in the world, the people who think there are two kinds of people and the people who don't. Quakers don't. We believe there's only one. But in the 1700s, as I read the records, Quakers accepted that good gospel order meant a social hierarchy. Some people wealthy, some people poor, men higher status than women, masters higher status than servants and slaves. And not surprisingly, that hierarchy tends to replicate within the Quaker meetings. George Fox himself kind of set that tone. His 1672 trip began in Barbados, where he stayed at the large sugar plantation, probably the largest on the island, owned by Quaker Thomas Rouse. While he was there, he wrote 2 long tracts to convince the governor that Quakers were not teaching Negroes to rebel. On the contrary, Fox argued, and by the way, Negroes is his word, and I've decided to keep it, even though right now it's not considered the best term. Fox argued that Christianity would make them more docile, more submissive, and more obedient. He also wrote several epistles to friends, encouraging them to treat their Negroes and Indians well and to give them religious instruction including taking them to worship and teaching them to read the Bible. Some people have tried to read Fox's writings as challenging slaveholding. I find that a pretty big stretch. That same advice was repeated over and over again for decades. For example, one Massachusetts meeting in 1706 encouraged friends to bring their children and servants to meeting, quote, as often as well they can. When people were asked to report whether they complied with this advice, they often acknowledged, quote, much shortness in that area, meaning we know we're supposed to do it, but it's not happening. And as I mentioned, even William Penn owned slaves for his plantation in Pennsylvania. And he was an absentee owner for most of that time. A few friends were troubled by slavery, including a small group of Quakers in Germantown outside of Philadelphia, who wrote what is now a famous protest letter in 1688. Those who objected mostly talked about the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them, etc. And some recognized that enslavement inherently required violence, both in how slaves were captured and in masters using violence and threats to control their behavior. Remember, Quakers by this time are pacifists. The lore among friends is that Quakers treated their slaves so well it was hardly like slavery at all. But frankly, that sounds to me like 19th century Romanticism. There is a request from one meeting for instruction from the quarterly meeting on whether it is acceptable to brand slaves on the face. Like, really, you had to ask that? Is it acceptable to brand? They had brands, like branding cattle. I've seen them. They put, the Royal Africa Company in Britain had a particular brand that they would brand people. Ooh. There's also a Massachusetts case in 1711 that I've done quite a bit of work on, in which the meeting disciplined and eventually disowned a woman friend for encouraging a whipping that was so severe that the man died a short while later, which the meeting labeled, quote, not only unchristian, but unhuman. But again, it's pretty clear from the minutes that they weren't objecting to slave owning itself, and they weren't even really objecting to whipping as a punishment. But this whipping went too far. And what you sense is an anxiety about how proper Christian slave masters should behave toward their servants. And servants is often the word that they used. It's in the King James Bible. It alternate, you know, it's what's used in the King James Bible, even for what clearly is slavery. This would put Quakers in the mainstream of a broader discussion in the 18th century British Atlantic, including within the Anglican Church, about the spiritual and practical obligations of Christian slave masters. All right, so that's kind of the bad news. And before we go on to the turning point, I'll take questions about what we've done so far. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Margot and James Lehman have a question. Can you speak about the ministry of Benjamin Lay and how it was received by friends?
Yeah, that's the beginning of the next section. So hold that one.
Okay. Next question. Did George Fox have specific views on slavery?
Well, as I say, he doesn't come out and say it's okay. But what he does say assumes that slavery is going to be there. So he's reassuring the governor of Barbados that, yes, we want to take Quakers, we want to take enslaved people to worship, but don't worry, we won't teach them rebellious thoughts. We'll teach them submission. Well, that assumes that you're not trying to disrupt slavery as a system. And again, his letters to friends saying, treat them well. And, as I wrap my brain around it, until he went to Barbados, I don't think he would spend a lot of time thinking about the enslavement of Africans. In the north of England, this was not a major issue. And I really think that in a way, he didn't kind of grasp that the relationship between himself and Margaret Fell, his wife, and servants in their manor house in the north of England, that this was somehow qualitatively different from Thomas Rouse's sugar plantation with dozens, probably hundreds of enslaved people doing the work on a sugar plantation, which is so hard. The average life expectancy for enslaved people who arrived in the sugar plantation islands was 7 years from the time they arrived. The work was so hard. So I don't think he really, he's visiting, he's staying in their house. I'm not sure he really grasped what African enslavement was really about. That's my sense. And he's reading, Paul's epistle to the Romans about obeying the magistrates, because what they do is, He also told Quakers that there was a big debate about slave patrols. He told them that they could not carry weapons on slave patrols. They could not go armed. That was a violation of the peace testimony. But yes, they should do their part to participate in the slave patrols to control criminal behavior. So one cartoonist in London said, so the Quaker will not shoot the mad dog, but the Quaker will stand over the mad dog yelling, mad dog, until somebody else comes and shoots the mad dog. But that gives you a sense of Fox not really objecting to the concept of enslavement.
And before we move on, Ben Richmond would like to know, how did it happen that these planters became Quakers? Were they some other denomination first?
That's a really good question, Ben. And I can't tell you the answer in Maryland. In Rhode Island, a lot of the people who became Quaker, and I definitely count my family in this, and Mary Dyer as well, came to Rhode Island as followers of Anne Hutchinson, who was thrown out of Boston for being a heretic, basically, and a witch. She was antinomian, and a lot of her beliefs are very similar to Quakers. We don't actually know, when they came to Rhode Island, whether they had worship at all. And And if so, what did it look like? There's no other church in Portsmouth, Rhode Island that we can tell before the Quakers show up. And I have a sense that certainly in New England, as in the north of England, when George Fox started preaching this stuff and gathering people around him, and other people joined in and were preaching, they were tapping into little groups that were already meeting outside, clandestinely, outside of the established church, and were already circulating similar ideas. And he kind of pulled them together. He and as I say, there were a whole group of very gifted ministers, pulled these folks together and kind of drew them into a systematic way of looking at the world, a systematic way of reading the Bible, and a structure.
And one more regarding Barbados. Natalie Williams would like to know, did you find that many of the Quakers in Barbados eventually left the island and settled in the Chesapeake Bay area?
I don't know that, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did. A number of them end up in New England, actually. Not only Barbados, it's Barbados, Nevis, St. Kitts, Antigua. It was very hard to be a Quaker in a planter society, in the sugar plantation society. The authorities gave them a very, very hard time. And a lot of them did move north. I don't know if they moved to the Chesapeake, but it's quite possible. A number of them do end up in Rhode Island. In fact, the man who was clerk of New England Yearly Meeting for 35 years, I think, was from Barbados, had been on Barbados. So yeah, there is quite a bit of migration, and the meetings in the Caribbean died out sometime in the first half of the 18th century. They sort of peter out. You get letters from London saying, hello, is anybody there? Why haven't you answered our last letter? And then the meetings, of course, the meetings in North America were growing.
Thank you.
All right, moving along. So what I call the Great Turning. As the question earlier indicated, some of the first really strident anti-slavery writings came from Benjamin Lay and a couple of his friends. There's Benjamin Lay. He's kind of an odd duck. He clearly had some physical deformities, and he was very strident and theatrical, kind of guerrilla theater, kind of person. And his manner turned a lot of people off. I'm not actually a big Benjamin Lay fan, but Marcus Rediker's recent biography of him treats him as a heroic prophet. So you can take your pick on Benjamin Lay. He was writing in the late 1720s, as I remember. There are several other anti-slavery pamphlets in that period, although it's not clear whether, and scholars disagree, did those pamphlets represent a much broader conversation, or were they isolated voices, but then people 100 years later looked back at them and went, oh, see, the Quakers even in the 1720s opposed slavery. Well, Benjamin Lay did. There were friends even before 1700 who made a deliberate decision not to own slaves, and there were some who freed those that they had held or those that they inherited, either in their wills or informally, often with a negotiated arrangement of, if you work for me for another 3 years, at the end of that time, I'll give you your freedom. I see those as enterprising, ambitious, enslaved people pretty aggressively looking for a way to work a deal. And a number of them were able to do that in this period. I mean, not a lot, but there are some, and we have some of their accounts. By the 1730s and 40s, the number of friends uncomfortable with slavery increased, and there's an increase in writings and pamphlets and tracts and so on. Interestingly, and I've never seen anybody really talk about this except me, that coincides in time with a dramatic wave of slave uprisings. You have the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739. There is an alleged slave-initiated arson plot in New York City, unclear if it was really a plot or what happened, in 1741. And there are rebellions at the same time in the Caribbean and on board ships. I mean, it's just this outburst of stuff. And I suspect that this cluster of rebellions really alerted friends to an inherent conflict between the slavery system and the violence required to keep it going and their pacifist beliefs. In the mid-1740s, a new prophetic anti-slavery voice arose, a young New Jersey minister named John Woolman. He took his first trip south to Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland in the spring of 1746, and he was troubled by being offered lodging in comfortable homes where, as he said, people lived in ease on the hard labor of their slaves. He felt that the combination of the slave trade and the idleness of white friends increased vices and corruptions, his words, and put a dark gloominess hanging over the land that would bring bad consequences down the road. And he doesn't say what he's thinking of in bad consequences. I'm thinking, we're talking about slave uprisings, but I don't know. In 1748, he came back, visited the Eastern Shore, and again was distressed at finding the Quaker meetings in what he felt was a declining condition. Woolman is a much gentler, humbler spirit than Benjamin Lay, and was a recognized minister. And in his appeals to friends, he emphasized the damage that slaveholding does to the soul and psyche of the slave owner, more than how awful it is for the enslaved person. And that seems to have found a sympathetic ear. In other words, he's saying, don't do this because it's bad for you, not don't do this because it's hurting the slave. And people could listen to that. Woolman is part of a larger movement in the 1740s and 50s to promote reform in the Society of Friends. The reformers were upset that after 100 years, several generations of friends who were members by birth and custom and not by inward transformation, the society was in a debilitated and kind of lukewarm blah condition. and they wanted to recover the spiritual vitality of the initial decade of excitement. Woolman felt that part of the spiritual weakness came from friends getting caught up in making money and living in luxury. He writes pages about the mahogany, carved mahogany furnishings on a ship that he was in. He called on friends to simplify their lives and focus first on spiritual matters, and that simplification included disentangling themselves from the slavery system. Later on in his life, he stopped eating sugar and stopped wearing clothes dyed with indigo, both of which, of course, were produced by enslaved labor. But many of the prominent ministers, including many of the reformers on both sides of the Atlantic, didn't seem to have a lot of interest in challenging systems of wealth, particularly their own. So when the reform movement got kind of codified in changes to the disciplinary rules, they sidestepped the issue of luxury and wealth and emphasized rules of conduct, rules against marrying non-Quakers, dress and speech codes, and generally building up the hedge between the society and the world on issues of style. But Woolman persisted. In 1754, with permission of his meeting, he published a pamphlet called Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes. And in the same year, probably with him doing a fair share of the writing, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting sent out an epistle condemning both slavery and especially the slave trade. Another Philadelphia friend, schoolteacher Anthony Benezet, also was publishing anti-slavery writings using new rhetoric that relied less on the Golden Rule and more on the natural rights of mankind, echoing the growing political conversations about liberty. And both Woolman and Benezet's writings and the Philadelphia Epistle definitely reached other colonial meetings, and as well as the yearly meeting in London. Woolman made another long ministry trip into Maryland in 1757, which, like the previous trip, brought him great distress at the spiritual condition of the meetings. And he again lamented that this inward desolation was linked to worldly, luxurious habits supported by the harsh labor of enslaved Africans. And he went around raising these concerns in conversations with local friends. I'm sure, he's a guest in your house and you're having to listen to all of this. Again, stressing the harm that slaveholding caused to owners. He also began a practice of offering compensation to the enslaved people who were serving in the houses that he stayed in. I've been working on a historical novel about all of this, and part of what got me thinking was, what would it be like to be an enslaved person and have this weird guy come and pay you for having helped stable his horses and feed his horse and feeding him at his meals and so on. So all of this is fermenting around on both sides of the Atlantic. And in 1758, after several years of discussion, the yearly meeting in London sent out an epistle cautioning friends everywhere, quote, to avoid being in any way concerned in reaping the unrighteous profits arising from the iniquitous practice of dealing in Negroes. In other words, slave trading, especially when done as a business rather than just, for your own use, is now against the rules and grounds for discipline, or should be. And it's clear that both London and the colonial meetings interpreted this as a directive, not just as kindly advice. And then London nagged people if they didn't implement it. Interestingly, I have found no evidence of London Friends enforcing any of that against English slave trading Quakers or English Quakers who owned Caribbean plantations. Then, as now, we could all come up with contemporary examples. Racism was viewed as an American problem. And so they're telling the American meetings to fix it. The Maryland meeting was slower than some others to adopt the London advice. It adopted it, then 6 months later, they were meeting on the other side of the bay, they revoked it, then they readopted it. London is nagging every year going, we didn't see you abiding by our advice. Finally, in 1762, the meeting officially made buying or selling Negroes a disownable offense. Although even then, it's the local meetings that have to enforce it, and they were slow to do it until after another Woolman visit in 1768. It's kind of easy to see why it took so long. It forced people to make a very hard choice. If you're a New England merchant or furniture maker or shipbuilder, first of all, you keep the same workers for decades. And second, if you have to manumit those people and put them on a wage system, it's not the end of the world. You can function, and they did. There are Quaker furniture makers in Newport who managed to do it. But if you're a tobacco planter and you're dependent on fresh supplies every year or two to keep your plantation going, and you need a large number of people, you can't really do that with hired labor, or at least they certainly felt that you couldn't do it with hired labor. So you either have to give up your entire way of life and livelihood, or you have to give up your membership. And I'm not as familiar with the Maryland records. I know in New England, some people made one choice and some people made the other. Then so that's slave trading. Then there's a further step on slave holding in each of the meetings. So in Maryland, first the meetings were advised not to appoint slaveholding friends as elders, which is like a leadership position. In 1772, they set up local committees to treat with slaveholders. That means sitting them down and saying, it's time. And that led to large numbers of manumissions. We have people manumitting 40, 50, 60 people at a go. In 1778, the meeting called for expulsion of any remaining slaveholders, and also made it clear that you can't hire enslaved workers that somebody else owns. Can't get around it that way. Even then, it took time to enforce that, and the meeting minutes include sporadic references to having to labor with people well into the 1790s. Everywhere, as far as I can tell, some Quakers freed their slaves gladly, some freed them under pressure. Some of those who were freed remained in the household, probably on very similar terms, but officially they were free. They might get Sunday afternoon off. And everywhere, some Quakers refused and were dropped from membership and either joined the Anglicans or some other church, or they kept going to Quaker meeting without being officially in membership. And as someone said, you're not expected to give money and you can't serve on committees. But other than that, you could still dress Quaker and the outside world might not even know. By 1785, the Quaker focus has really changed, and this is why I've used it as a cutoff date for my work. Many friends realized after going through this process that convincing individuals one by one to voluntarily give up their slaves was difficult and didn't eliminate the slavery system. So a number of Quakers became active in the new anti-slavery societies, often joining with non-Quakers. I understand that in Maryland, it was the Methodists who were most active with Quakers in the anti-slavery societies. In Rhode Island, it's Baptists. And they were lobbying state legislatures and the US Congress. By the mid-1780s, many northern states passed gradual emancipation laws, hard to enforce, but they were there. And in England and the United States, Quakers became central to the national campaigns to outlaw the slave trade entirely, which happened in 1807 in Britain and 1808 in the US. And then the clandestine trade continued, for another 50 years. Friends also at this time became concerned about the well-being of formerly enslaved individuals, an anxiety that was shared by towns, which did not want to become responsible for formerly enslaved people who were unable to support themselves and would become dependent on town welfare. Some meetings and some individual friends took steps in the nature of reparations to make sure that freed slaves received an equitable financial settlement, often payment of back wages or a gift of land that they could farm. Maryland Friends were advised to offer quote unquote strict justice to former slaves, but that wasn't defined and apparently didn't always require compensation. What Quakers did not do, and perhaps could not do, was to disentangle themselves from an economy that still relied on enslaved labor. Rhode Island Quakers, like Moses Brown, were instrumental in opening the first, and he's an active abolitionist, instrumental in opening the first cotton mills using Southern cotton. Some of those mills made a cheap weave called Negro cloth for sale to planters looking for cheap clothing for their people. New York Quakers financed and transported cotton to English mills. And most Friends continued using slave-made products like sugar, rice, and indigo. How many of them, unclear, were willing to do business with free Blacks who ran, had a little entrepreneurial thing going. Few, as far as we can tell, welcomed them into their homes or meetings. So the story after 1785 continues to be complicated. And with that, I will stop sharing and we can take more questions. Here we go. You're muted, Joy.
Keep doing that. Sorry about that. So we have a question from the Thompsons, and they would like to know, from Sylvia Henderson, and she would like to know, how did Quakers view runaway slaves from the South? Let them be or actively turn them in to slave captors?
No, I think I'm not as much of an expert on the Underground Railroad is primarily a 19th century, 1820s, 30s, 40s. And a number of Friends were very active in it. And others were quietly supportive, and people did not keep records. The thing about the Underground Railroad was nobody wrote down what they were doing and to whom they were passing. You didn't do that because you didn't want to put people at risk. And the Quaker reputation for truth-telling was put under some strain. People found very clever ways to avoid lying, but also avoid disclosing what they were doing. it became an art form. But there is evidence. My friend Chris Densmore, who has done more work on that particular period, says he's seen a lot of evidence in African American sources of people being advised, head north and look for Quakers. In other words, Quakers were considered safe, and Quakers were dressing distinctively. There's a charming children's book called The Hannah about a girl, obviously it's fiction, a girl in Philadelphia who hates her Quaker dress and her Quaker bonnet, and she wants lace on her petticoats and flowers in her bonnet like her best friend. But then she's able to help a woman fleeing for freedom who recognizes her by her Quaker bonnet and recognizes her as safe and asks her for help. So there is that sense. And there were Quakers in Vermont. They're descendants of people I've tracked in Rhode Island, slave owners in Rhode Island, who had a farm in Vermont, and they regularly had people staying with them for a year or two on their way north. And then they'd go the rest of the way to Canada. So I think it was common enough that word was around that Quakers were safe people to ask for help. But was it universal? I don't know. I've never heard of a Quaker turning somebody in.
Thank you so much, Betsy. This has been an amazing, enlightening conversation. And while we are at the end of the conversation tonight, and I am going to turn it over to Allison, what we will be doing is this will be recorded, this has been recorded, as many of you have asked, and Allison will be able to tell you more about that. And we will stay on possibly for a few more questions after the meeting closes. Allison, thank you so much. And Betsy, thank you. This was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you both, Joy and Betsy. We did want to try to wrap up at 8 o'clock because I know that's what people had on their schedule, but our moderator and our guest speaker are happy to stay around for a few more minutes and answer any questions you have. I also just wanted to mention that we discussed that we want a follow-up to this program to be what did emancipation mean to the freed Blacks? So we are going to be working on developing a program like that, and we'll be sharing that with you in another History Happy Hour. So thank you so much for everybody joining us this evening. We hope to see you again, and please stick around if you have any other questions.
Thank you. We do have a few questions coming in. We also have a lot of comments. People are very grateful and thank you and say that this is a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Some would like to know if there will be information given out to connect with you, Betsy, so that they can ask you questions.
I just put my email in the chat, and you can also find me on Twitter.
Wonderful.
There are no other Betsy Cazdens on Twitter that I'm aware of.
That sounds great. Let's see what else we've got. A lot of thank yous. Can you tell us where, Allison, possibly the recording will be uploaded to? We've got a question from Nazreen who would like to know.
Sure. It takes us about 2 weeks to get the recording. But we will be posting it to our YouTube channel. So just go to our website, click on the YouTube channel, and you'll see all the programs that we've recorded.
Great. One last question from Graham and Janet Johnson. Quakers in North Carolina found that they continue their crops without slavery and therefore moved to the Midwest.
Right. Yeah. North Carolina is an interesting situation because all of the states were hesitant to have large numbers of free blacks. The concept of having large numbers of free people of color integrating into their communities was just like, people couldn't even imagine what that would look like. So they're thinking, well, we'll free them and they'll go back to Africa, or we'll free them and they'll go someplace, but not here. And in the South, it basically became illegal to be a free person of color. So that left Quakers in a real quandary. I mean, in Rhode Island, you can free your people. Moses Brown, freed his people when he became Quaker, before he became Quaker. And you can give that person a bit of land, you can help them out, you can hire them onto your whaling ship. That happened a fair amount. In New Bedford, you can rent your house to them and do business with them. In North Carolina, you can't do that. And so the combination of, can you be a plantation owner without enslaved labor? No, it doesn't really work. And if I free these people, there's no way for them to live here as free people. So there were a lot of migrations from North Carolina, and actually from Virginia and Maryland as well, up into what was then the Western Reserve, Ohio, and then Indiana. And in fact, you can track meeting names. There's New Garden Meeting in North Carolina, and then there's New Garden Meeting, I think, in Ohio, and then there's New Garden Meeting in Iowa. And those are migration patterns. But the other thing in North Carolina that they did was, if you freed somebody, they were subject to being re-enslaved. So North Carolina yearly meeting took title to a lot of enslaved people for the purpose of officially somebody owning them so that they could live as free people. It's a little like a conservation land trust. You can't have land that doesn't have an owner. So you set up a land trust that holds title to land so that it can be kept undeveloped. And they did that. So North Carolina actually owned slaves during a period of time when individual friends were not allowed to own slaves. And it's really bizarre, but it was because of how difficult the state of North Carolina made it to actually free people. They basically made it impossible to free people and have them stay free. I'm sorry, that was a long answer, but.
Thank you. We have one more question from Patty Nesbitt, and she would like to know, who is Chris Dearmore, who quoted "Head North and locate Quakers"?
It's Chris Densmore. Yeah.
Densmore.
He typed it into the chat. He was librarian at Swarthmore. He was head of the Friends Historical Library. He's retired now, and I've lost track. I don't have a good contact information for him. I should, because we were college classmates and our big reunion is coming up, but I don't have an address for him. I'm sorry. And I don't know if Swarthmore knows. Is Ellen Ross still on? She might know how to reach Chris.
No, she's not.
As I look in the chat, that is our last question. We do have someone who previously asked about Sandy Spring and any information that you had regarding the Sandy Spring Quaker meeting.
Yeah, I don't have a lot. Let's see. Do I have a picture of Sandy Spring? I thought I had a picture of Sandy Spring.
Several people noted that several prominent Quakers in the area had freed those who were enslaved. Richard Thomas of Cherry Grove, Sunny Notes, freed over 100 people who were enslaved in 1806, probably at the urging of his brother. Someone else had stated that there were another group of the Thomas family had manumitted approximately 200 people in 1806 as well, lest they be written out of the meeting.
Yeah, it's this is the Sandy Springs Meeting House, which was built in 1817. It's the third meeting house, and it's still there today. I was in it quite a long time ago. I was there for a conference or something, but it's still. Pardon?
Got a picture of a dirt road in front of it. That's an old photo. It's still there, but that's an old photo.
Yeah, yes, that's an older photo. That photo, I think, is from the federal government historic building survey, which was what, in the 1930s, something like that.
Someone has suggested, yes. Well,
you know, it's interesting. You see these stories of people freeing slaves in 1806, 1807. They should not have been in the meeting owning slaves by that time. But there's an interesting controversy going on right now about Johns Hopkins family. That
They asked how to find out about Quakers in Maryland.
NPR had a piece about Johns Hopkins. The university has always said, oh, he was a big abolitionist. The family were big abolitionists. Well, it turns out both his grandfather and his father, who were Quakers, are listed as owning slaves way past 1775, way past 1780. And that Johns Hopkins himself, the one whose money established the university, also appears to have had enslaved Negroes in his census, in his house per the census. So I've looked at that when the news first came out and went, if they're Quakers by 1806, they should not be in the meeting and holding slaves. So I would love to know more. Maryland is not my, it's not where I've spent my time reading meeting records, but I'm hoping that somebody will someone from the Quaker end will take a good look at that family's relationship to the meeting.
thank you so much.
Anything about Sandy Springs, that's the kind of local work that I hope that your museum and the Sandy Spring meeting can pull together that part of the story. All it takes is sitting and reading a lot of minutes and a lot of probate records.
Thank you very much. And you've given us some wonderful talking points and points to start from to begin delving more into how the Quaker relationship and the relationship of Blacks in the community evolved in Sandy Spring.